Well, good evening, everybody. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the fourth of our 4 Downtown Future Forums. My name is Matt Bronson. I'm the Assistant City Manager here in San Mateo. And first of all, let me say, this is an awesome turnout for a forum on downtown parking. Give yourselves a hand for being here tonight on a beautiful Wednesday evening here in San Mateo. To have this kind of turnout, standing room only for parking. Downtown parking is awesome. It shows how engaged our community is, how committed, how focused. So thank you all for being here tonight. We look forward to a great evening, some very enlightening, provocative thoughts and ideas from some great speakers around the parking community. And we look forward to your comments, to your questions, to your discussion at the end of tonight's forum. So welcome. A couple of quick housekeeping items. First, I'd like to welcome our council members who are here tonight. I saw Deputy Mayor Jack Matthews. Is he here? Yes. Over on the side, thank you. Also, I saw Council Member Rick Bonilla. So thank you for being here tonight. I saw several of our department heads. Police Chief Susan Manheimer, they're front and center. Hello. And right behind her is our Community Development Director George White. Thank you for being here. I see a number of our boards, of our commissioners from our various boards and commissions. Too many to list here in the beginning, but thank you for being here and thank you for your service to our community. And let me ask you, how many of you have been to all 4 of our future forums? Raise your hands high. Awesome, awesome. So our wonderful reporter from Daily Journal is here to also capture us. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of this wonderful process, Downtown Future Forums. I'd like to first off start off by thanking some other folks as well. First, I'd like to thank Marcus Clark. So I'm stepping into a role that Marcus has played for the last 3 forums. As some of you know, Marcus has unfortunately left the city over the past month to return to his native Sonoma County back in Santa Rosa, but he's here with us tonight in spirit and presence, and we miss Marcus greatly. Marcus has done so much for our organization, for our community, and we wish him the very best in his future endeavors. So I'm stepping into a role, and Marcus can certainly fill any room that he is in. I'll do my best to do that as well. Fortunately, the room is smaller tonight than our other room, so it'll be an easier task perhaps, but again, thank you to Marcus for everything he has done for this process, for all the future forums, everything he's done. I'd also like to thank our staff folks who have also helped us, Julia Klein in Community Development, Ron Munakawa, everybody else within our organization, within our staffing. Also the M Group, our wonderful consulting team who has helped put all these forums together. Thank you for all the work that you have done. And most of all, thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for your commitment, for your engagement, for your dedication to our community and to the future of our downtown. Tonight it's all about parking, but also challenging our conventional thinking about parking. And as we said earlier, it may not be what you think. So we'll talk for a moment about why we're here, where we've been, where we're heading, talk for a brief moment about parking in San Mateo before turning it over to the presentations and really devoting most of our time tonight to the 3 presenters who are going to be speaking to us. While we're here, as we've talked about at 3 prior forums, the landscape is changing around downtowns. We wanted to really tap into some outside thinking, some best practices, and really help in guiding us and provoking us and looking at some different models of the future of our downtown. We started off, as you know, with a kind of broad landscape of downtown planning, went into activating public spaces, talked about transit-oriented development, and tonight it's all about parking. So 4 key topic areas around downtown, bringing in some leading thinkers from the field around us to help guide us and inform us in where we're going. An opportunity to frame our next steps. Looking back over the past year, we've done quite a bit of community engagement in different forums and settings, starting off with our Commissioners Summit and Stakeholders Forum last October. We had a series of stakeholder focus group meetings, pop-up workshops at Central Park and other places downtown. The 4 forums that I mentioned earlier really as a key foundation of our efforts. We did a technical advisory panel from the Urban Land Institute to get in some outside consulting thinking. We've done using our town hall website, our project website, all of this building to developing an asset and opportunities plan that will give us a sense of what the community has told us, what our outside presenters have shared with us to inform our downtown plan update, which is really the next phase of this process. Tonight marks the end of our future forum process. We're moving very quickly right into our planning efforts. In fact, I'll mention that on August 17th, just next month, we're sharing an update to the council about a framework for the next phase of downtown planning, really focusing in on key opportunity sites to think of some conceptuals of what these developments could look like on key sites such as the former redevelopment sites at the Kinko's and Work Resource Center parking lots. That's on August 17th, Monday the 17th, and that will be really the next phase of our downtown planning going forward. You've seen this project roadmap at previous forums. It's a little hard to see given the size of the screen. I apologize, but this really kind of represents the very end of our initial engagement process after all the workshops and forums that I described earlier. Just some visuals to show everything we've done over the last several months, from the pop-ups to the sticky notes on various photos. Hopefully, you've all had a chance to be part of these various forums, these various workshops, and really kind of representing the kind of engagement that we see every day here in San Mateo. This word cloud is also something we've been showing at previous forums to show kind of key top-of-mind items about downtown. You'll see parking is very prominently featured, of course, as is Caltrain traffic, but also things like bike lanes and pedestrian walkways and other modes of getting around without being in your car. So we'll be talking a little more about that tonight. And just briefly, before we turn it over to the presenters, in terms of parking in San Mateo, overall, we have a good story to tell in the work that we've done. We have a long history in providing public parking in San Mateo. We've been doing this for over 50 years in the interest of providing economic vitality and supporting that vitality in our community. In downtown, we have 3,000 public parking spaces that are managed and provided by the city of San Mateo in both off-street lots and on-street spaces. But yet, over time, we felt that we were somewhat reactionary in our parking policies. We weren't looking at the customer experience. We weren't looking at how to maximize our existing spaces. So that's really what led us to develop a parking plan, which culminated in the council adoption of the plan 2 years ago, which really set the stage for where we are tonight and where we're going. It told us that we need to use our spaces better, use our existing 3,000 spaces more efficiently to get the most out of them. We need to improve the customer experience so that customers don't dread having to park in San Mateo, but it's an experience that at the very least is negligible, if not enjoyable. Go figure. We also have a kind of a phase plan for implementation. So we took us a while to get to where we are. It'll take us a while to improve our system over time. So the first phase was to make policy and rate changes that went into effect just this month to help base parking rates on demand and occupancy to increase parking availability. The next phase is to make operational changes to our permit program to help make that more rational and improved. To also improve valet parking to make that more of a realistic strategy. To improve our pay stations, our equipment, use better technology. To again, make the experience better for our customers. Over time, we do want to increase parking capacity, but look at a variety of different tools, different approaches to doing that. And overall, and this is the segue into our presentations, we have a desire for innovation and creativity. We think we've run a good track, but there's a lot more we can do better, and we really see the speakers tonight and others as helping us get to that point in bringing in their ideas and creativity. So that's where we are today, and now we'll hear more about where we could go tomorrow. And with that, I'll turn it over to our presenters, and I will briefly introduce them now. So our first presenter is Jeff Tumlin. And for any of you who were part of the Taste and Talk series last year, Jeff was our original speaker, January 2014, with a very enlightening title of Sex, Neuroscience, and Walkable Communities. So we're delighted to have Jeff back with us again here in San Mateo. Jeff is the owner and director of strategy at Nelson Nygaard Consulting Associates. He has led station area, downtown, citywide, campus-wide transportation and parking plans and programs. His projects have helped in reducing traffic and CO2 emissions by over 40% and have accommodated millions of square feet of growth with no net increase in motor vehicle traffic, which is a pretty impressive result. He's received numerous awards from different organizations and is a noted author as well. We're delighted to have Jeff join us. Following Jeff is Brian Canova, who is also an owner and director of operations at Nelson Nygaard. Brian's an expert in developing cost-effective parking and transportation demand management plans for downtown, and really brings in planning approaches that include policies that can work in the real world, policies that work in everyday communities, and help to build in community engagement and involvement. He's worked on plans for a variety of communities up and down the state. And then lastly, our third speaker is Willa Ng, who is the Parking and Transportation Demand Manager for the city of Berkeley. So we're delighted to have you join us from the East Bay. Willa has done a lot of work in Berkeley's program, and Berkeley is one of the trendsetters when it comes to parking policies, parking demand. They're, I'd say, a few years ahead of us, and we'll look forward to learning from their program tonight. Prior to Berkeley, she worked for the New York City, the city of New York City, excuse me, and she also worked as a traffic engineer as a private consultant, and she loves California, originally from New York, and she loves the plums and pluots here in her adopted state of California. We have three great speakers tonight. They'll bring in a variety of different perspectives, and with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff Tumlin.
Once again, my name is Jeff Tumlin, and while I am a native Californian, I had the misfortune of being born in Los Angeles. I know. But I had the wisdom to move to the peninsula in 1987, and I've lived in the Bay Area ever since. But as part of my LA roots, I did get my driver's license on the very day of my 16th birthday. I've been driving ever since, and I still believe the television commercials that tell me that driving should be fantastic. And so as a motorist, there are a few things that I enjoy more than an empty parking space, especially right in front of where I want to go. But as a business person and an economist, one of the things that I also need to recognize is that every unused parking space is a wasted $30,000. That's sort of the minimal cost of what it costs to build a parking structure. In fact, down in Palo Alto and in San Jose, they've been building parking structures at over $70,000 per net parking space. Parking is expensive, and while I usually never have problems with people hearing me. Yes, I'd be happy to speak loudly. So, while a successful downtown absolutely requires sufficient parking, a successful downtown has more to lose from too much parking than too little parking. So our challenge here is to find the right number of parking spaces, and most importantly, manage the existing parking spaces well. Mismanaging parking is the most extraordinary waste of resources. After all, a motorist doesn't need a certain number of parking spaces. She needs one empty parking space, and she needs to know how to find it, right? This is our challenge in a downtown. Downtowns are different than suburban sprawl. So this is somewhere down in the South Bay. We don't need to know where it is. But this is what happens with parking. When you manage each individual development parcel and insist upon sufficient parking for every single individual parcel at its peak. And you'll notice this is mixed-use development. So you've got some office. Over here, you've got some retail, there's some residential, there's a hotel or something, who knows what that is. And you notice that there's plenty of parking, right? This is the sort of development where you can always find a parking space, but at a cost. And the cost is if you work in that office building and you want to go to lunch across the street, you are likely going to get in your car and drive across the street in order to get to lunch. If you wanted to get off of the light rail station that is over off there in the corner, you can't even see it, you're not going to want to walk to the business across the street. You're going to insist upon a shuttle to take you there, because this level of parking accommodation ensures that every single trip is by car. This kind of development pattern, by accommodating automobile trips, creates a reality where all trips are by car, and as a result, the walkability is destroyed and your traffic congestion is severe. Downtown San Mateo operates on an opposite principle, which says, sure, we need to accommodate your trip here by car, but when you arrive here, you're going to walk around and do a bunch of different things, and moreover, we're going to insist upon such unrelenting walkability that getting here by Caltrain or by bus or walking in from the surrounding neighborhoods is still going to be a delightful thing to do. There's also other consequences of over-parking a place. There is a powerful relationship between parking provision and housing affordability. Every parking space I add to a residential unit increases the price of that unit by about 15 to 30% and decreases the number of units that I could build in a typical parcel by about 15 to 25%. For households that can live in a wonderful place like downtown San Mateo and can afford, therefore, to give up one car, that entitles them to an additional $100,000 in mortgage. That's what it costs to own a car over the 30-year life of a mortgage. And also, it's important to keep in mind that when you factor in the amount of space that a parking space takes up plus the fraction of the drive aisles, that's 300 square feet per parking space. That's the size of a studio apartment. Every housing unit for a car is the same as an affordable housing unit for a person. And yet, we insist upon minimum housing requirements for every motor vehicle and not for people, to the point where there are 4 or 5 housing units per car and not enough housing units for our citizens. So, even when we provide parking for free, that cost doesn't go away. Somebody is paying for that free parking. If you provide free parking with a residential unit, that increases the rent on a typical unit in the United States by about $225 per month. And as we start thinking about the social equity implications of hiding the price of parking into our rent, or into the cost of goods or services, or into the cost of our commercial leases, that means that everyone is paying for that parking. Disabled people who don't own cars are paying for that parking. Low-income individuals who tend to be disproportionately African American and Latino are paying for that parking and directly subsidizing driving for people who tend to be wealthier and more white. Not managing our parking spaces by insisting upon more parking than we have traffic capacity in order to drive cars to that parking space, and also not managing it so that people can find a space, means that people are unnecessarily driving around in circles trying to find a parking space. I went around the block, 2 times just coming here tonight. Every time I made a turning movement into your downtown street, I exacerbated congestion unnecessarily. If you can manage your parking such that you reduce just 10% of that unnecessary driving around in circles, you can eliminate traffic congestion. This is the math of traffic congestion. If you're mismanaging your spaces, or if you're adding more space than you have roadway capacity in order to get to those spaces, you're creating your congestion problem. Nonetheless, it's really hard to have a rational conversation about parking. Parking is one of those topics that makes all of us a little crazy. And I don't quite understand the human psychology of this, but we know some things. When you're the best employee in your business, you don't get a raise. You get the front door parking space, right? Because parking confers status. For some reason, we strongly associate that best VIP parking space with status. And we know in the movies that the only person who can get a front door parking space in the Mission District in San Francisco is a Hitchcock blonde. Tippi Hedren always gets a front door space, but not you or me. We expected that from her. And we also For many of us in our neighborhoods, we get really uncomfortable when other people park in front of our houses, right? That street, we don't own that street. That street doesn't belong to us. That's a public street. And yet, all of us perceive that to be a part of our territory, and we need to know who's in our territory. And so as a result, when our expectations about parking have a mismatch with our experience, we also get really resentful. When our sense of entitlement around parking is violated, we get angry and we do sometimes crazy and stupid things. And yet, our attitudes about parking are changing, in part because of demographic changes, in part because of attitudinal changes. We know from the research on millennials that millennials are delaying getting their driver's licenses. And in locations where driving is optional, a lot of them are choosing not to drive. And a part of that is that my generation was the last generation that believed that owning our own car would bring us freedom, autonomy, social status, and sex. Young people today know that there is something that brings them freedom, autonomy, social status, and sex, and driving is the one thing that takes them away from the thing that gets them what they want. And so this attitudinal shift is also resulting in increasing interest in places like Downtown San Mateo. Downtown San Mateo offers the perfect mix of accommodating the car and yet also offering good transit alternatives, but more importantly, unrelenting walkability and a rich array of interesting services. You've got the best downtown on the peninsula. And part of that is because of the way that you have handled parking, that you put it in the back, and that you've emphasized walkability and shared parking tucked away in places that I can find, or where people can find it. Nevertheless, this is a topic that does literally drive us crazy. And I'm all glad that you're here tonight to listen to this, so we can think in a more sophisticated and systemic way about the role of parking and how important it is to manage it well. So what do we do? So Willa and Brian will talk in a bit in more detail about some of these key principles. And I'm going to run through some principles, all of which your city is currently implementing, but each of which you can step it up a little bit on. So the first thing to recognize is that for those of you who are residents, you bought into a different San Mateo than your city is becoming. Your city is changing. And no matter how hard you try to stop that change, it's gonna still happen because the economy and demographics are changing around us. And so providing some level of protection for the surrounding neighborhood so that we can experiment and be more thoughtful about downtown parking without creating a huge spillover problem for surrounding neighbors is one of the first places that we typically start in. And to make those residential parking permit programs really customer friendly so that it's easy for you to deal with your guests and so on. The next thing to recognize is that the reason we charge for parking, literally the only reason we should be charging for parking, is to make it easier for customers to find a space. If you're thinking of parking as a tool for raising revenue, stop it. Charging for parking is, you do it in order to make your downtown more economically successful by making it easier for customers to find a space. And so your whole approach to parking management should be as an extension of your economic development strategy for your downtown, focused on the customer, which means making all of your parking meters accept forms of payment that normal people have on their person. They all need to accept credit cards and debit cards. They all need to accept pay by phone, and they all need to call you up on your cell phone and ask you if you want more time. Because the last thing that you want is to literally criminalize a shopper who is spending more money than she thought she was going to, and then is coming back to find that she has literally been criminalized for having a more successful shopping trip. So use the right technology for your meters. Also use technology to help motorists find the empty parking spaces. If it costs me $30,000 to build a single parking space, it is always cheaper to use technology to help motorists find those empty spaces that already exist rather than build new ones. So use the best technology to help motorists find those underutilized spaces that are tucked around. Very importantly, once you start charging for parking, which you're already doing, recognize that the right price for parking is always the lowest price that ensures a few spaces are always available on every street, in every parking lot, and in every garage. This is incredibly important. The right price for parking is always the lowest price that ensures you meet an availability target. If you charge more than that, you'll end up with too many empty parking spaces and complaining merchants. If you charge less than that, motorists won't be able to find a space, and you'll end up with complaining merchants. And oh, by the way, charging the lowest price gets you the most revenue, right? For some reason, only in parking do we not let the market balance supply and demand. So charge the right price, which means that parking on street is going to be a lot more expensive than parking off street. Parking here on B is going to be a lot more expensive than parking 3 blocks away. Redwood City does this, as does San Francisco. We'll get to that in a second. The next point is to be very conscious about what you do with your net parking revenue, because your merchants and your citizens will still accuse the city people of being evil, money-grubbing bastards for charging for parking. So be thoughtful about where that revenue goes and try to invest it in places where that revenue is raised. Parklets here, learn from your experiments here, learn from Mountain View, learn from San Francisco, and allow merchants to put cafe seating out on the parking space, because that sort of thing makes for a successful downtown. Once you've started managing your parking well, you don't need to force developers to build more parking than the market would warrant. In fact, what you need to make sure is that you're producing a limited number of large, publicly oriented shared parking facilities that are easy to find and easy to manage. The last thing that you want is a ton of tiny little parking spaces back behind the building and lots of curb cuts across your retail streets. You need a limited number of large shared supplies of parking. In fact, there are cities that have effectively established parking maximums for reserved parking at 0 and require that any private parking be built be shared. So lots of cities are also thinking about total citywide parking caps as a congestion management and housing affordability strategy. Lots of places, actually including San Mateo, you have a pretty good track record of this, making sure that whatever parking gets built is designed well. There is no excuse in a downtown like San Mateo for ever compromising the quality of the pedestrian experience in order to create a few more parking spaces. Make sure that, particularly in your residential leases, but also in your commercial leases, that you require developers unbundle the cost of parking from the cost of housing and the cost of parking from the cost of commercial leases. Don't force your residents to buy more parking than they need, and at the same time, allow residents who have more than the 1.75 parking spaces per unit, allow folks with 2 or 3 cars to be able to lease the parking that they need. Encourage the most space-efficient forms of parking, including stack parking and valet parking. Build in car sharing into your parking program. Every car share space that we put out in the street in most cities eliminates between 7 and 24 private vehicles. So encouraging more Zipcar here in San Mateo is a very important part of the program. But most importantly, pull all of this together into what you're already so effective at doing here in downtown San Mateo, which is what we call Park Once, which means that rather than having a separate parking space for every land use, which means that every trip is a drive trip, which means that there is a lot more congestion off of your main street. Instead, orient all of your development so that it faces onto the sidewalk. Put the parking behind and encourage your motorists to drive to downtown San Mateo and do many different things with one parking space. Here in downtown, you're basically getting 5 times the economic activity per parking space than development anywhere else in your city. Recognize the extraordinary benefit that designing as you have already done creates in terms of tax revenue, quality of life, and reduced congestion compared to doing the same development in a different way. San Francisco has been experimenting with all of this for the last couple of years in the SF Park program by adjusting the parking price in a very, very fine way using smarter technology and adjusting the parking price not only by location but also by time of day to ensure that 1 or 2 spaces is always available in the demonstration SF Park sites at all times of day. And what they found was that they didn't need to have that significant of an adjustment. In fact, there were more locations where the price of parking went down than it went up. And in total, while the city ended up with some net parking meter revenue, the enforcement revenue went way down, so that the net revenue was actually only slightly up. But the result of that is not citing customers, right? So we're no longer criminalizing customers in San Francisco, while making it a lot easier for them to park. The result has been a reduction in congestion, an improvement in transit travel time, an improvement in walkability, and an improvement in retail sales, all by getting a little bit smarter about parking. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Brian, who will go into a little bit more detail about background here in San Mateo and some implementation steps you might want to think about.
I'm Brian Kemp, also with Nelson Nygaard. Jeff is always a very hard act to follow, very charismatic guy, but I'll try to do my best. Hello. Okay, there we go. All right, now you all can hear me. So I'm going to cover actually more specific parts of parking, and I'm going to get hopefully not too wonkish on you, because I'm really going to focus on parking standards, about how those are developed, how they influence the built environment, and how they interact with on and off street parking. And so this is the brief agenda while I'm sitting here talking for about 10 or 15 minutes. But at the end of the day, I'm going to just start out by talking about why parking is the way it is. And I know that's kind of a little bit of an open-ended question, because parking is extremely important, that we all use it almost on a daily basis. And as Jeff said, you don't want to provide too much or too little of it. So what's the magic behind it? You know, what's the magic formula that we're dealing with here? Well, I'll just kind of walk back in history first to the conventional approach to parking. And this is really when I mean conventional approach, I mean post-war, post-World War II. When we started implementing requirements, many cities did, to say, hey, we think that private developments should be requiring the provision of so much parking that that parking will be simply given away for free. We'll just have so much parking, people will always be able to accommodate their trips there, both on and off street. And with any economic good, you've increased the supply so much that your price essentially drops to zero. And you look at the stated purpose of these minimum parking requirements, and this is actually straight from the San Mateo Code. For those in the back who can't see it, is to alleviate or prevent congestion of the public streets and to promote the safety and welfare of the public and to reduce street congestion and traffic hazards. Which is actually funny, because if you go to places that have lots of parking, they actually tend to be the most congested areas when it comes to automobile traffic. Because in reality, what minimum parking requirements do, and what they're really designed to do, is prevent spillover parking. So that when I go to a business and I park there, I'm not parking in front of Jeff's house and he's getting angry at me. But oftentimes what you find in terms of the urban form of minimum parking requirements is something like this, that you get a relatively smaller building and a much larger parking lot around it. And you find that at the end of the day, minimum parking requirements don't always necessarily guarantee that someone is not going to simply, for example, park on street. Why would I go and park in a less convenient off-street lot or garage when I can simply park on street, potentially for the same price, but at much higher convenience? And people are confounded by the idea that these are oftentimes the places that people want to go and be in, similar to downtown San Mateo. But it's difficult to make the connection that high minimum parking requirements actually prevent you from being able to build this. You end up in a situation where you're providing far more space for parking than you are for buildings. And at the end of the day, you say, well, so what's the magic number? All right, Brian, you talk about all this parking information. Should we be providing a lot of parking or a little parking or nothing or what? And at the end of the day, it's really context sensitive. It depends on where you are. If you say, hey, I want to build a Walmart out in the middle of a field somewhere, and you say, I'm going to provide it with one parking space, I'm going to tell you that's not going to work, right? Because of simply the nature of where you are. Similarly, if you're downtown San Mateo and you have a denser, more walkable, more bikeable area, you can tailor your requirements accordingly. And when you actually go to look at where the problem, or quote, the problem is, when you go to look at where the actual problem is, you find that people will say, gosh, I have a really hard time finding a parking space, because when they go on street, they find something like this, where they simply cannot find an on-street parking space, when in fact, perhaps a block or two away, there are actually empty off-street parking spaces that they may not even know about. So what we find oftentimes is that when it comes to requiring parking, necessarily requiring more empty off-street parking spaces doesn't help you find an on-street parking space. These two are different things. And so when we look at how that plays out in San Mateo, we actually looked at the parking management plan that was recently put together. And some of the data and some of the opinions that came out of it said that folks said, hey, there is a parking problem here in downtown San Mateo. And what we found is most of the people really are talking about on-street parking. Similar to the image I showed 2 images ago, is that really when I go to find a parking space, the trouble I have is finding an on-street parking space. I can't park in front of the business I want to park in. Or simply I can't find an off-street spot that I can find a space for. And you actually can see that in charts. This is a chart simply of showing parking occupancy over the course of the day. And you can see that over every part of the day, you have much higher occupancy in your on-street spaces than you do in your off-street spaces. So this goes to what Jeff was talking about, is that you have essentially a market good that is not priced accordingly, right? If there are so few people parking in these off-street spaces, either A, if people don't know those spaces exist, or B, they're priced too high. And similarly, the reverse can be said for on-street spaces. And you actually see this play out in the data. As Matt mentioned earlier, some of the changes that might be occurring here show that really changing prices towards, increasing prices towards your core and decreasing prices at the periphery of your downtown can actually make a large difference in terms of your occupancy levels, right? Highest demand is internal, lowest demand is on the periphery. And this is actually public opinion, not my public opinion, this is actually drawn from the parking management plan, that showed that a lot of the people who contributed to the plan said, yeah, maybe having this varied pricing actually makes sense to a certain degree. That you actually can have maybe some moderate increases in parking price, maybe even some moderate decreases in parking price, so that I actually can find the space that I need. So again, using parking price and parking regulations to help you find the space that you need, rather than simply saying, hey, business owner, please produce more off-street spaces which may or may not actually be used. And so we find this is not atypical. A lot of communities experience this. In fact, very big communities experience this, very small ones. This is actually a picture from Sacramento, which actually experienced very similar things. And hopefully everyone can see I apologize for the dark background, but these are just some common findings that we see in a lot of communities. And the first one is one I already talked about. That simply, if you have an on-street parking problem, building more off-street parking spaces will not necessarily solve that. So, and that directly correlates to the requirements that you have in that area. 2 is that from an economic development standpoint, if you're trying to build a small business on a small lot, more often than not, it's actually not possible to simply accommodate the parking spaces, and trying to pay a fee for those spaces instead often becomes economically infeasible. Although the fee actually can be used quite well sometimes. And that there's a whole host of other urban form problems that come along with it if you actually require individual businesses to produce their own parking. So as Jeff mentioned earlier, curb cuts. For everyone who's unfamiliar with what a curb cut is, when you walk down the sidewalk and go down, that's where the driveway is. That's actually also a safety hazard because it means it's less safe for pedestrians with cars coming. It's also less safe for motorists, as cars could collide with other cars. And so what we find with a lot of parking requirements, and San Mateo actually does a pretty good job of this. I actually should back up a second and say that San Mateo's requirements are pretty, on the whole, pretty good. But that they lack a lot of flexibility that they could have. So for example, if I'm a developer coming in and I want to build on my site and I say, gosh, there's simply just not enough space on my site. But look, Jeff has a building right next to me and he has a few empty parking spaces that he knows are not being used. maybe I can lease those spaces from him for my employees. Something along those lines, so we actually take advantage of spaces that are not being used and actually maximizing your resources. Because if you don't have this, a lot of times what you do is you create a parking entitlement process that's very uncertain, which is not the end of the world, but you do want to make it, it's more beneficial both for the city and for developers if you actually make it mutually beneficial. So you actually can adjust requirements at the end of the day to be tailored by location, right? As I mentioned earlier, requirements here in a downtown very often, more often than not, will not be the same as they are in perhaps your residential districts around town, and oftentimes they shouldn't be. And so what you really need to be doing is tailoring your requirements to meet the needs of the type of requirement that you're seeing. So for example, small lot development. If you're saying, gosh, we cannot fit parking on these small lots, it's just simply not possible, maybe the requirements should reflect that. Or if you say, gosh, we're really trying to achieve a certain type of development. We want businesses on the bottom and residents on top for a vertical mixed use. Adjust requirements like that. It can be a whole host of things. All I'm saying is that your requirements can be tailored to encourage or discourage the types of development you do or do not want to see. And you also can notice that a lot of park requirements out there will actually become super specific. I've seen some parking codes that will literally list 50 different land uses, so that if a florist tries to go into a different building that was run by a tailor shop or something like that, they actually have to provide a different number of parking spaces, which makes it very difficult for businesses to transition from one to another. So I apologize for the small type in here, but you can see down here we have the grab and run attorneys, morning brew, splatter, and good reads. So different types of shops that can rotate in and out of the business because they have the same parking requirement. This is also a great way to use historic buildings too that don't provide that same level of parking that current buildings do. By doing this, you actually make a much more predictable process. And San Mateo actually benefits because it actually already has what we call an in lieu fee. So if I'm a developer who comes in and I simply cannot provide those spaces, I can pay a fee. And that fee can go towards a whole host of things. Different communities use it for different things. It could be building actually more shared parking. It could be making streetscape improvements. It just really depends on this jurisdiction. But a lot of places are also looking at other ways of being able to accommodate parking demand. To say, okay, you can't provide your parking on site. Well, maybe instead of providing one more parking space, maybe we'll have you provide a lot of bicycle parking instead in really innovative ways, because we know at the end of the day that will actually benefit more users. Not to say that you'll eliminate the parking requirement, but maybe just a portion of it. And there's a whole host of alternatives out there. Many alternatives. One of which I know Matt mentioned earlier, which is something like valet parking. This is something I'm actually working with a different jurisdiction out in the East Bay right now. And valet parking, for example, has become extremely high tech, so that you want to make it a user-friendly experience. So when you walk out, I'm in the restaurant, I can click my button. It will actually alert the valet service to where my car is, wherever I parked it in downtown. And so by the time I actually leave the business, it will actually be ready for me. These are the sorts of advances that technology is making possible. And a whole host of other different trip consolidation measures. Now, what these measures are designed to do is say, hey, developer, or whoever is coming in, you have an option. Instead of providing some of your parking spaces, if you can show us that some of these things actually work, and actually reduce the number of trips and get people here by other modes, hence reducing parking demand and traffic, then we'll allow you to do that. And lastly, the off-site parking strategies, and this is something, again, that Jeff had already touched on, but really these residential permit districts, and I'm going to just hammer it home because it is extremely important. Because mismanagement of parking can lead towards parking spillover into residential neighborhoods, you want to make sure you do have the right regulations in place. Sometimes you don't need any regulations, and that's completely fine. Sometimes you actually do want residential parking permits or something of those variety. And I know that they already exist here in San Mateo, but they can be tailored in many different ways. But at the end of the day, understand that all of that requires some level of enforcement. So just to throw that out there. But you do see that when people develop off-site parking strategies, it can be for residential parking. It also can be for commercial parking on site. So what, I'll do my final note on this, is that a lot of downtowns like your own have a lot of businesses that may have small parcels here and there that have individual amounts of parking there. And you say, well, gosh, you know, there's a Bank of America down the street, and we'd really love to be able to use their parking at night. I'm circling around, but their parking lot is empty, and I can't park there because they say it's their property. This is a huge problem in a lot of downtowns. And what you actually really need to do oftentimes, and some cities have been very successful. The city of Sacramento, I know it's a much larger example, has actually done a fantastic job actually reaching out to property owners to get what they call shared parking agreements. So if I'm searching for a space at night, I can say, hey, look, that off-street, that bank parking lot, I can now park in at night. And you do so by indemnifying the owner of the lot. You do so by offering financial compensation and things of that sort. And you say, gosh, Brian, this seems ridiculous. Why would you pay someone to be able to use their parking space? And I would say, because it's a lot cheaper than paying $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a structured space if those spaces are empty. So it's just more ways to be able to use your spaces that you already have in order to maximize your resources. So with that, I will turn it over to Willa.
I am a principal planner at the City of Berkeley. I work for the Department of Public Works. And I am amazed that there are so many of you here tonight. I'm really impressed. I kind of suspect that Matt might have paid a couple of people to be here. So it may just be sour grapes from the fact that I don't have this type of turnout in my public outreach. But just a little bit of background about the City of Berkeley. We are the home of the university, UC Berkeley. I have a population of about 115,000 people, and we run about 3,000 metered parking spaces. It is a wonderful place. If you've never been, I do welcome you to come by. I am the project manager of a program called Go Berkeley. And the Go Berkeley program started in 2013 with 3 goals. 1 was to support economic vitality. 2 was to improve customer service. And 3 was to reduce congestion. And the way that we did that was that we manage our existing parking supply by adjusting parking rates and time limits so that there was always 2 spaces available per block. That was our target. We were very transparent from the outset. That's what we're trying to do. And after 2 years of operation, just last month, we moved from pilot operation to permanent operation with unanimous approval of the City Council. So that is my whole story, that is my whole presentation, but I will still make you go through it because I have some time. So, in terms of what we saw when we started the pilot, this is maybe something very similar to you. We started in 2 areas, the south side and the downtown area, and we saw congested parking. We saw congestion caused by traffic circling, looking for a space, and we also had some underused parking supply nearby. This is one of our garages, the Telegraph Channing Garage. And more than anything, I think the merchants were telling us that they suffered from a negative perception that there was no parking available in Berkeley, when that simply wasn't true. There was parking available. It just wasn't right where people wanted to go, so they heard the complaints. I am going to pause for a minute just because I wanted to get a feel of the room. You can raise your hands, please raise your hands, and you can do it more than once. Who is a resident of San Mateo? Who is an employee here? And who owns a business? Thank you, just gives me an idea. We also had one area which was not a downtown, and it was very important for us to also operate in that area, which was a commercial strip surrounded by residential. And in that area, we did hear a lot about these fears that Jeff and Brian had talked about spillover into the residential areas. We also heard a lot about out-of-date regulations. What happens when you have a loading zone or a green zone, pickup drop-off zone for a laundry, a cleaners? They move out, and all of a sudden you have a movie theater. Those parking regulations aren't right anymore, and the city doesn't pay attention. That was one of the things we heard. We heard that time limits were too short for people to accomplish their business, and we heard that we had too much confusing signage. People just want to be able to go down the street and know whether they can park or not and how long they can park for. That's all they want to know. We did have some limited equipment, so we did upgrade our equipment during the course of the pilot, and we didn't know what was going on on our streets. We didn't know what the demand was, what the occupancy was. So these were all the problems that we faced. In addition to this, and I'm sure that San Mateo is going through something very similar, we had adopted a climate action plan. We want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We love our planet as well. In the same time, we also had a lot more development coming in, and we're asking people to use alternative modes. Please ride your bike, please walk, please use transit to get to the downtown. And not as many people as we wanted to were doing that. Still people were driving. So what did we do about it? We luckily got $3 million in grant funding from the federal government to launch the Go Berkeley pilot. That really did help us out. There was some very good seed money. In terms of launching this pilot, where our theory was we wanted to combine both parking and encouraging people to take alternative modes. The idea being that we wanted to give people the first option to not drive, and then for the people who did want to drive, to improve their parking experience so they didn't circle looking for a parking spot. We did a lot of project planning and outreach, and our pilot period was actually only 20 months. It was July 2013 we kicked off, and we ended March of 2015, so just recently. In terms of selecting our pilot areas, we selected 3 of them because we wanted a range of parking conditions, a variety of needs, and these were actually the areas where we had active business associations, and this is very, very key, is the participation of the business community in designing a parking program. We had the partnership of the business community. They wanted to try this out. It was a pilot. They said, what the hell, let's give it a try. And they supported us the entire way. So this is just to give you an idea of what the project timeline is. We started it in July of 2013 with our TDM program, which I'll talk more about. Basically, we handed out free transit passes to employees in the area and started and installed car sharing vehicles in the 3 pilot areas as well. In October and December 2013, we went through our first rate changes at on-street meters and off-street garages and lots. Then we collected data, a lot of data, a ton of data. And we went back to the public, we discussed this with them, made some additional changes, kept adjusting it incrementally to try to get to the right price. As Jeff was saying, the lowest price to achieve the availability that we were looking for. In July of 2014, the TDM program ended, and we started an overall evaluation of the program to talk to the city council and the public about. We had promised to come back and show the results of this data collection, and we did. So in terms of the public outreach, I am so jealous of all the people who are here today, but we also went through our public outreach as well, and it was really important. One of the things that Jeff showed in his presentation was SF Park's design. The block-by-block pricing, the time of day pricing, where prices change by the morning into the afternoon and the evening. We offered that to our constituents, and they said, keep it as simple as you possibly can. Well, we said, science says that you should do this, and they said, no, don't confuse anybody, just keep it as simple as you can. And that was really important for us in terms of designing the program that would work the best for those communities. We did travel surveys of 200 businesses, 400 employees, thousands of visitors, 4 rounds of open houses. We went to the city council so many times, stayed up so late for that. We had our website, and we also even just went to individual merchant groups and resident groups to talk about the program. So what actually happened? Like I said, we gave away 1,000 free AC transit passes, and we implemented car sharing we added a lot of new pods, car sharing pods in our pilot areas. And what we got was a decrease in employee drive alone trips just from the transit passes alone. Handing out these passes, giving them the option to not drive, decreased employee drive alone trips. Unexpectedly, we also increased the amount of biking and walking that went on as people decided to continuously leave their car and use another mode instead. It was an extremely popular program. The car sharing program, Lessons Learned, that was not as popular. People drive for the reasons that they drive, and if I were to do it again, I wouldn't take on the car sharing program. That was an expensive program for us to take on. In terms of the parking program, we instituted something very similar to what's going on right now, which is that we had a very congested core, and we had parking at the periphery. So we defined these premium zones in the congested areas and then value zones outside of that. We also tested escalating rates in some of our neighborhoods in the attempt to balance some of that parking. And when I say balance, I mean really, if we had a block that had 10 spaces and had 10 cars parked, by adjusting the rates and time limits, we really only had to get to 2 of those drivers to get them to choose to walk a few blocks for a space that was cheaper and where they could park for longer. It was really about giving people options. We also wanted to make parking in our garages a first choice. And to do that, we even went as far as to give away free parking in our parking garages. The first hour free, the Telegraph Transit Garage, became extremely popular. We extended time limits because people told us that time limits weren't enough to complete their business. No one wants to rush back to their car. We extended them to 2, 3, and 8 hours. Now sometimes when I say that we extended time limits to 8 hours, people think I'm insane. But it's a pilot, so we'll give anything a try. And what we found though was with an 8-hour time limit, the average time that people will park is about 3 hours. People don't park just to park, but they love the flexibility of being able to park for as long as they want to. We responded to the business and visitor needs that they wanted standardized parking. They don't want, people like to be able to expect something when they go to a parking area. They want to know, hey, if I go down B Street, it's going to be 2-hour parking limits, and I'm going to know that it's a little bit of a more expensive rate because it's in such high demand there. These are some huge signs that we made, and they were the most popular part of our project. Some people hadn't even noticed that we changed the rates or the time limits, but they did notice our signs. In fact, when we ran a survey of people who had just parked, 50% of them had no idea what rate they had paid. So in terms of the sort of the fear that, raising the parking rates are going to drive people away, you don't usually notice, especially with these new meters that accept credit cards. You just put your credit card in and push the maximum button and walk away. It's about the convenience, not about the rate. So what were the overall results? We did indeed see drivers shift from the premium areas to the value areas. So the theory works, the science works. The parking availability improved. What we saw was 12% of the blocks in our areas had much better parking rates or much better parking availability than before we started. Now 12%, you might say, a lot of the academics tell me that's wonderful, Willa. In terms of what I look at it as, it's like 12% doesn't sound like a lot. But when we went out and did our customer service surveys, 78% of drivers told us that they can find parking easily now, which is up 41% from when we asked that same question before we started the pilot. Now this piece of data actually causes me some heartburn, which is that comparing before and after the pilot, we saw a 29% increase in the number of transactions at our parking meters. which means that we have more people than ever coming to our areas and finding a parking space. Now, as someone who doesn't particularly like it when people drive, this bothers me. For the business community, they love it. They say these are more customers coming to our area. Why would you tell me that this is bad news? So in conclusion, we saw a reduction in employee drive-alone trips. We improved parking availability and time limits. There are more parkers coming to the area than ever before. And those parkers are finding spaces more easily. So the science does work. What's going on now in San Mateo should bear the same fruit. Parking rates and time limits can change driver behavior. In terms of the support for continuation, it was a pilot. We came back and we said if it doesn't work, we'll take it away. And the Transportation Commission voted unanimously, so did the City Council, to continue. When we ran opinion polls, we were running about an 82% public approval rating for a program that raised parking rates at some of the most competitive spaces in the city. And as I said in the beginning, we entered permanent operation in June of 2015, just last month, with direction from the City Council to explore an expansion of the program to the rest of the city. One of the things that underlies all of this is the amount of data that has to be collected to set the parking rate at an appropriate level. We told the City Council we can't keep going with this unless we offer you a cost-effective way to collect that data. And so I wanted to tell you a little bit about what we've done, which is that there's something called license plate recognition technology. I don't know if it's in use here in San Mateo. It's used for many cities to enforce time limits. It recognizes a license plate and IDs a vehicle that way, and when it drives around again and it sees the same vehicle, it knows that it's been there for a certain amount of time. We wanted to know if this technology could be used to collect parking occupancy data. So we ran a demonstration of it, and it is surprisingly effective. What it also is cheap for the city to do. We are able to basically use the police's equipment to collect the parking occupancy data that is needed to adjust parking rates up or down. So in terms of lessons learned for San Mateo, this is really more for the city staff in the room. This is a cost-effective way to run a program like this. Jeff said something about being crazy if you do this for the revenue, and it is absolutely not about the revenue. In fact, we made the City Council explicitly note that since we were lowering parking rates in some areas, that they could lose money with this program. We had them acknowledge that. What did happen, actually, is that revenue did go up. What was really surprising to me was that it went up the highest in the areas where we lowered the rates. We were underusing parking, and when we lowered those rates and extended those time limits, the occupancy just went through the roof. We were making more money there than ever before. However, it's very important for us to direct the revenue to the right place. So we want to send it to areas where we can promote customer service and to get people to take alternative modes. Where we're starting to direct our money, we're still really in the middle of this, talking about this at our councils and in our communities. We want to improve parking, bring it to a state of good repair. If necessary, replace some of the parking facilities that are now out of date. We don't have pay by phone yet, which is a real shame, and hopefully we can bring it in soon. And in addition, we would like to invest in alternative modes. Since the Transit Pass program was very successful, we'd like to continue that on a larger scale. We're investing some of that revenue in the bike share network for the city of Berkeley. We'd like to, if we can, provide other transit incentives as well, and to direct some of this revenue into streetscape improvements so that more people will actually come and walk to the downtown as well. So that's my presentation. I'm going to hand this back to Matt.